Welcome, everyone. Really appreciate you attending our event. This is going to be a great conversation today. My name is Angelique Young. I am here on behalf of the Truman Center for National Policy, where I'm the executive vice president, and I'm joined by this phenomenal panel of experts comprised of various folks coming from different perspectives, including Truman members, but also from our partner in this endeavor, Coinbase Institute. And we continue to be really grateful for the partnership that's allowing us to bring these critical conversations on national security and technology to our community and beyond. This is going to be a fascinating conversation. I think there's going to be a lot of interest. So just a quick heads up at the beginning that there will be time for Q&A towards the end, but I'll ask that you send your questions in the chat, either post them to everyone in the chat or post them directly to me, and I will send them to the moderator to be answered. And in the meantime, just be mindful to keep your microphones on mute so that we can all hear this great conversation. And with that, I am going to turn it over to today's moderator from Coinbase, Robin Cook. Take it away.
Thanks so much, and thank you all for getting on the call today. My name is Robin Cook. I'm Coinbase's legislative counsel, and I also lead our federal government relations team. And I gotta say, this is a really exciting moment in time to have my job. And this is an exciting panel to be able to talk with you all about today. A lot is happening on crypto policy this summer, and I think that this event, which is the fourth in a series, and the Coinbase Institute is really proud of the partnership with Truman and to be involved in all of this. But it's an exciting time in terms of what's happening on legislation. Major financial services legislation happens in this country about once a decade. This decade is crypto. And that is, in and of itself, I think, a really exciting opportunity. We've seen already this year the first bill out of the Senate Banking Committee to cross the Senate floor in 8 years, and it's a crypto bill. And market structure is the next logical step, and we're really excited to talk about it today. The Genius Act got out of the Senate. We are strongly supportive of that. In the House, they recently passed the Clarity Act out of the Financial Services and Ag committees with strong bipartisan votes. And there's a lot of momentum and forward progress on crypto legislation to happen this year. I think when people think about crypto market structure legislation, they think about it through a lens of consumer protection. And of course it is that. They think about it through a lens of CFTC and SEC licensing issues, and it's that too. They think about it through a lens of how exactly are trades executed? How do the pipes and the plumbing of all of this work? How is it that we're building the future of the global financial system through the policy decisions that are being made this summer? All of those things are 100% spot on. But it's a national security issue too. And that's, I think, one of the more overlooked aspects of all of this. It brings with it registration, which in and of itself brings with it a whole host of important national security and consumer protections that happen automatically by operation of law. It makes sure that crypto is safe. It makes sure that AML and terrorist finance happens in a way that keeps the ecosystem safe from bad actors. And I think it also allows the US government to lead and be able to continue to shape this infant technology. So in short, this is a critically important moment for us to be getting all of this right. And so I'm happy to today introduce our incredible all-star panel, starting with Liat from Elliptic. If you can just take yourself off mute and introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see everyone. Thanks, Robin. And thank you to the Coinbase Institute and to Truman for bringing us together today. I'm Liat Chatret. I'm our VP of Global Policy and Regulation at Elliptic, which is a blockchain analytics company. We trace and track illicit crypto. I spend most of my time shuttling back and forth between New York and Washington, other hubs to discuss crypto policy and regulation. And I'm delighted to join the conversation today. Thank you so much for having me.
Robert?
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Leah. So Robert Donovan, Truman Project National Security Fellow since about 2010, which makes me old. I'm currently the MLRO for crypto at PayPal Digital. I've held a number of industry roles. I was previously a management consultant with Pricewaterhouse, and prior to that, state regulator. Specifically, I had oversight for the bit license and crypto supervision at New York State DFS for a time. So I'm delighted to be here.
And Austin.
Hi, everybody. I'm Austin. I am a adjunct professor at NYU Stern School of Business, where I teach a class on blockchain. I've previously been around in the space doing stablecoins for a while, and I had a long traditional financial services career running trading desks at Citi and JP Morgan in fixed income.
Well, appreciate you all joining and the incredible expertise that you all bring to this conversation. I want to begin with some basic ground truth just to make sure that we're all operating from the same page. And Austin, I'd like to start with you on this. What exactly is crypto market structure legislation? Why is it important for digital assets? And why is this such an important, pressing conversation for the industry?
Yeah, so one of the lessons that we've learned over time in traditional financial markets before we sort of transition our way over to crypto is that markets, although they can be self-forming and self-evolving, often suffer from problems, failures, breaks, and sometimes simply lack of clarity and coordination without a set of standards under which to conduct ourselves. And you will run into situations when that happens where either consumers are harmed, or we have systemic failures because regulators can't observe things, or there's just confusion about how things should work and a lot of mutual disagreement, sometimes even among regulators themselves. So if we look at something like market structure for crypto, or Robin, specifically, you had referenced the Clarity Act earlier. So let's drill down on that a little bit. What we're trying to do is say, what are the base layer principles under which a system should be operating by when you use blockchain rails? And that's particularly important in this case because, I recently wrote a paper on this with V from Anchorage. In fact, she deserves a huge amount of the credit for that. But describing our current system in traditional finance in the US is sort of an agglomeration of band-aids that we've been putting on there since the paperwork crisis in the 1970s, and that trading a single stock on your Robinhood app can involve 9 intermediaries, not an exaggeration. And blockchains are a radically different potential way of doing things. You can decentralize clearing. You could decentralize a lot of the data and visualization and market monitoring functionality. And so we need a new set of rules, right? There's nothing in the current securities legislation that explains how to do decentralized clearing because the concept was not possible. And when you run into those things without a base layer to understand these things, nothing works. And Robin, to your earlier point, if you don't develop it in these cases, other people will. So the other thing that's important about this legislation is it's not happening in a vacuum. Like, the system is already evolving. Other nations are already looking at it. So we are on the clock for this.
Yeah, no, I think that is spot on. More than 80% of the G20 has already moved on crypto legislation. And I guess the question, Liat, for you is, what does that mean in terms of our ability as the US government to be able to shape a technology? Is it just, should we assume that if we don't do it now, that we will be able to do it later if Congress continues to punt on these important strategic questions?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. I think Austin kind of laid out the urgency, right? If we don't do it now, all market participants will have an opportunity to engage in regulatory arbitrage. We'll have an opportunity, if you're a criminal, to exploit the financial system. There's a lot of building happening on all sides of the market. So the urgency is there. I think that the concept of ensuring this happens now brings us back to very basically good fences make good neighbors. We need to have this clarity of how overall the overarching market should operate. And I think where the big issue is for the US is that it will ensure better global cooperation and coordination, maybe across regulators who, if we look at our industry, we need to have that desperately. Otherwise, we're creating these shadow economies. Things are happening outside of the framework, and we need to bring that and push that squarely into the light. And it comes back to the things we were talking about earlier. The consumer protections are critical, and these are the moments to implement that and to level out that playing field, to bring in kind of compliance principles, reduce that risk of regulatory arbitrage. And these are the moments while Congress is focused on it. We've just passed Genius, on work is ongoing there. these are the moments and the historical moments. They don't come around so often, right? So the momentum is here and the moment is now.
Agree with all of that for sure, and need to keep my mouse right hovering on the mute button so that I can avoid those good awkward pauses. But Robert, I want to turn it over to you next. How does all of this fit together with sort of baseline national security conversations? Why are the two inexplicably linked?
Yeah. Well, economic power is an important source of national power, right? And national power is important to national security, right? Despite that the US is a slower mover now, I will point out that, the largest publicly traded crypto companies are US, right? The largest publicly traded TradFi companies or fintech companies that have moved into crypto are US. I think some of the most influential blockchain forensics, important for the security of the crypto ecosystem companies are US. This is largely because we understood at a very early age, at a very early stage, the national security and the law enforcement imperatives around regulating crypto, right? Crypto regulation in the US really started in the wake of the Silk Road takedown in 2013. Right, when FinCEN said this activity is money transmission activity, and all y'all please come and register as MSBs with us, that triggered a mad rush among the several states to define whether crypto activity was money transmission. Some said it was or not. Some said it's not, we want nothing to do with it. And then some, like New York, said it's not, and there ought to be specific rules for it. Right. So in many ways, the US was an early regulatory leader. And I think you see that in, the way that some companies, have been able to grow and prosper. And I would argue that, economic power, including economic power from crypto financial institutions, some of the largest of which are US, is an important component to, national security and national economic power.
Robin, can I add to that, please, just on what Robert, I love what you said, and just a few notes to add on here. I think the complexity of the global conflicts we've seen have also shed light on roles that digital assets are playing in all of that. On the one hand, there's fundraising ongoing for humanitarian initiatives to alleviate humanitarian issues. You've got ideological fundraising going on globally. Increasingly, digital assets are being used in sophisticated kind of global criminal operations. And I think that nexus with TradFi is also making more complex the obfuscation angles. And so when it comes to kind of national security levers that we have, say sanctions controls or terrorism finance or chasing down funds that may be used for building the next nuke, there's challenges there that we need to have, again, coming back to that clarity. There needs to be that clear framework that has us speaking the same language and that standardized language. And all of those come together to really make a bit of a national security, to make it fully a national security issue.
That makes a ton of sense. And Austin, I want to turn it to you next. And just given your background with traditional finance, I'm curious your take on how the frameworks that we're talking about from a national security perspective, from an AML perspective, from a financial crimes perspective, compare with the obligations that are in place for traditional finance.
Well, let's start, I guess, with an unfortunate baseline truth, Robin, which is that the current financial system is not very good at detecting crime, right? Like we have built a lot of systems in the traditional framework trying to detect crime, but the problem is the fundamental system design itself is sort of fighting with that goal in a way that was not intended. It's just a factor of how we've done it. Because if you think about, let's start with the current world and then we'll start mapping sort of these obligations as we move on. If you think of the current world, let's say that Robin, you bank at a bank, we'll call that Bank A, and Robert, you're his relative and you're overseas and you bank at Bank B. There could be a chain of events where Robin sends money to Robert overseas, and then Robert goes and spends that money at a business through a card, and then that business pays a dividend to an owner, which is two more banks down the chain, and then that owner sends money to somebody like, let's take Hamas because they've been in the news. And now we're looking at this and saying, well, how would Robin's Bank or Robert's Bank even know this happened? Everybody is their own island. They see themselves, and they see at most one hop connections away, sometimes, not even if you use an ATM or something like that. So this is a very fragmented space, and we have AML and KYC and like transaction monitoring and all these things because you're trying to fight crime by everybody having a flashlight and looking only at their feet in the dark, right? That's obviously not going to give you a comprehensive view of the world. Now zoom out to blockchain world. Here, even though it's pseudonymous, we have a ledger where Robin, your bank in this case, and this is why I specifically use this as an example, could have seen the transaction chain of, oh, say a stable coin or some crypto token that originated with us, went to Robert's bank, got spent at a business, went to an owner, and oh no, right? Now it's somewhere we really don't want it to be. Like, let's take a random American bank. Wells Fargo strictly cannot detect that in the traditional system if they were the originating bank, but they can using a blockchain. Even if you don't know the exact identity of everybody at those steps, it's much easier than people think to identify wallets of bad actors in this space. There are some intelligence firms like that are private sector affiliated with the DoD that are doing a surprisingly good job of this right now. Liat may have more to say about that later too. And when you have a public grid, even if you don't know the identities of those people and you start mapping it, we will find way more crime. So what I would say is mapping the traditional obligations onto a blockchain, although elements of those obligations can and are being mapped in legislation, and they should be. If you look at Clarity, if you look at Genius, these things are in there. I'm actually wildly optimistic about the anti-financial crime component here, Robin, because I think we can definitionally do better in a system that works this way because it unlocks capabilities that don't currently exist. And by the way, those capabilities do not necessarily involve KYCing every single human being on the earth and transforming, back to national security, some of our financial companies into the largest honeypots and targets for hackers that have ever existed.
That was a really great explanation, and I appreciate that, Austin. Liat, I'd like to turn to you because the reference that Austin made to you having thoughts, I think that you work for one of the companies that specializes in that sort of investigative work. And so curious if you have additional thoughts and how, in particular, the differences between what we would think of as a normal know your customer process when you can know your transaction, how the tools that are available to law enforcement differ with traditional finance.
So I do work for one of those companies, and challenge accepted. Let's see if I can do this justice. Thanks, Austin and Robin. So I think I would just pull back one second to say, we don't want to be locking those definitions into the legislation, because what we are seeing is that the evolving nature of the space just means that everything is happening in real time. It's super quick, it's super fast. So let's not freeze anything into legislation that will basically inhibit our abilities to do anything in the future. And when law enforcement or financial institutions or banks or or crypto exchanges insert your entity, deploy blockchain analytics, it's essentially enabling them these superpowers of real-time tracing of transactions, real-time identifications of illicit wallets, and the ability to monitor and cross-border flows and stop and freeze them, escrow them, whatever they need to be doing. The basic building blocks of compliance historically, know your customer due diligence, those almost need to have a flex process. So KYC flex, CTD flex, in order to accommodate for the characteristics of the ledger, characteristics of crypto, characteristics of programmable money. And all of that really introduces the new characteristics into the old formats. And so what we've been seeing is a lot of innovation around how can you do know your customer to maybe extend that term to know your wallet. You don't have to know specifically the name of a person or an entity controlling a wallet to see that wallet is engaging with a deep set fentanyl addiction and dark net market purchases done at wee hours of the night, or to determine that some wallet is engaging in nefarious terrorism finance activities. And those insights for law enforcement and banks allows them to pre-screen in advance and recognize what from a risk perspective, what from a law enforcement, let's go catch the bad guys perspective, or obtain a subpoena perspective, what are their options? And sometimes we hear from law enforcement that in fact they're looking for the traditional investigatory nexus and touch point to crypto because it opens up an avenue of information that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. The access to a crypto nexus with TradFi gives them insights to activities of a wallet, behaviors, habits, traceability that they wouldn't have otherwise. And they could make better network maps, they can make better connections and identify areas to intercept and interdict to bring those to a close. And they can do it in real time, and the speed there is compressed. The investigatory timeline is significantly compressed, and that's huge when it comes to resources, when it comes to the knowledge and the availability of these tools to help law enforcement work smarter and faster.
And if I can ask just a quick follow-up question there, we hear a lot about AI, I think, in a variety of contexts. And I'm especially curious when we start talking about the layering of these tools together, what role AI can play in terms of being able to see things moving in real time and ideally to stop it from moving in real time when we see bad things happening in real time.
Yeah, so there's a big difference between what we're seeing in terms of hype AI and crypto nexus, and then what we're seeing is effective AI crypto nexus. What I can share here is that the way we've seen AI most effectively layered into kind of crypto blockchain analysis from our perspective has been twofold. So on the one hand, when we identify a illicit typology that, for example, is operating to obfuscate purposely a peel chain or some kind of activity that we know is blurring the lines to source of funds, where AI comes into play and is very good and strong at is to essentially then transverse massive amounts of data and identify those same kinds of obfuscation typologies so that next time when you're bumping into some kind of structure, you can immediately say, oh, okay, well, that's an obfuscation technique right there. Let's highlight that one. So on the one hand, it's again that strength of AI to just look through tremendous amounts of data and find that needle in the haystack. So there's that capability. Another one that we're utilizing very effectively is essentially to interpret graphs or interpret what it is that we're seeing through the summarization capability, to interpret the swapping across different assets in combination with the number of hops, in combination with timelines and velocity. What could this mean? What could this be? And so an investigator's timeline, again, their timeline is compressed where they can just look at the data and the indicators and they don't need to manually begin piecing things together. The LLMs, the AIs are helping to bring that to a close. Also, for example, drafting up suspicious activity reports or SARs. That's a job. Who wants to sit there and be manually piecing together the SARs and the visuals and the justification? And then, the SAR that goes to that jurisdiction needs to look this way versus the SAR that goes to that jurisdiction. So there's a huge amount of automation, and we're elevating compliance to a whole new level, which is both exciting, but also, we have to do it in an iterative process because you don't want AI changing risk scores. You don't want AI retroactively adjudicating a case differently. I mean, that's painful. Austin, I see you're eager to jump into the AI chat. Go for it.
Yeah, I was going to say what's very interesting hearing Liat talk is the capabilities are expanding here in a way where we could make a sandwich that was not possible previously in traditional finance. So like if we think of what Liat said with all of the AI and blockchain analytics capabilities as the top piece of bread on a sandwich, something we can now start doing is in TradFi. Another thing that people typically do here is like adverse media, like news exposure, things like that. But like the problem is it's relatively hard to then interpolate that effectively in many cases that are not like corporates or public figures. Because if you were to just take the name Austin Campbell, like me, and Google that, there's probably like tens of us across the United States. Like Campbell's a pretty frequent name, Austin's a pretty frequent name. There's going to be more than one of me, right? And so was it me? Was it somebody else? Was it some dude in Idaho? Like it quickly becomes an identity problem. However, using open source intelligence techniques on social media feeds, on chat data, on SARs, all of those sorts of things, when you combine them with blockchain addresses, because those are unique, even if they're pseudonymous, actually gives you much better data. And what's fascinating about that is if you apply OSINT techniques at one layer, which is its own thing, like using media data, social media, essentially the kinds of things Meta knows about you, with what Liat is doing, on the analytics firm side with the blockchain data and like mapping all of that, again, we get a much better graph of a financial system and bad actors than is, I want to be clear, possible in TradFi. It's not even that we aren't doing it right now. It's that definitionally we can't do it with how obscured that system is.
Yeah, the name matching is something that I personally know from some rough experience. In 2002, my father and I both ended up on the TSA no-fly list for, we share a name, and we both were on the no-fly list for reasons that we couldn't figure out. And it took a good amount of time for us to fall off. And in the days after 9/11, you just had to deal with that. So we certainly appreciate that all too well. Robert, I want to talk about this from a compliance perspective, given your background. And I'm curious your thoughts just in terms of the current fragmentation that exists in the marketplace and what that means in terms of building a compliance system for a large organization and what could happen in terms of compliance innovation out of the certainty that legislation can provide.
Yeah. I mean, I think, a couple things, right? Number one, diversity of, regulatory requirements allows for, the innovation to arise, much more readily than imposing very large, cumbersome structures, right? One of the things about, the legacy US approach to crypto regulation is, that it was an MSB, a money service business, a money transmission centric system, which meant you had to get a FinCEN registration, yes, but then you could pick and choose in which states you wanted to operate, right? So it did allow, and at present it does allow for startup companies to get their legs about them, operate in the several states that don't require the don't require licensure, right? And then to enter smaller regulated markets, before they need to go and get licensure in New York or soon, as will be required in California, right? And I mean, there's two sides to that, right? On the one hand, it gives them, kind of like a sandbox to be able to innovate and to be able to develop while, they pilot new technologies, right? Startups are nothing if not strapped for cash, right? And seeking, innovation. And so, I think with the advent of Gen AI, right? I mean, Leah, I loved your example of drafting of SAR narratives. That really allows, smaller companies to kind of punch above their weight. At the same time, it reiterates the need for, governance and risk management around some of these systems. To the extent then, though, that a US, regulatory regime or regulatory schema becomes the de facto standard for a globally operating crypto company, I would argue that's a great way to export high bar U.S. compliance standards and candidly sanctions compliance regimes globally, right? I mean, if you look at some of the early, in the wake of 9/11, some of the early actions that FinCEN and DOJ and the New York State took, right? It was exporting, U.S. sanctions obligations around the world to those who used, the U.S. dollar. Well, with USD backed, or denominated stable coins, right? You can achieve much the same thing, right? And, to the extent that, sanctioned entities are malicious actors, right, who have it in their, on the radar screen to do harm to folks, I think that's, very much a global good, right? I do want to, get back to the point though around balancing the need for, exporting that globally, right, and high bar standards to right sizing, regulatory structures, right? I mean, even the bank regulatory regime in the US, there are, when you look at the Fed's approach to it, there are different standards for banks of, different sizes and complexities, right? Which should have, in theory, the same type of risk-based approach, for crypto, right? And I will point out also that, within the bank, regulatory regime in the US, we have a dual banking system, right? So, yes, you do need a primary federal regulator, be that the FDIC or the Federal Reserve, based on your business model, but you can choose to be state regulated, if you're a small community bank, a small savings bank, or you can choose to pursue a national charter when granted by the Office of Comptroller of the Currency, in which case, state laws are preempted. But then you do have to deal with, with the higher bar of federal oversight, which, for all my friends who are thinking about, a federal solution to crypto regulatory regime is giving us clarity, I'd urge you to read some of the enforcement actions, that have come out of the Federal Reserve, that have come out of the FDIC, or even the CFTC and the SEC with respect to crypto.
Robin, can I make a dramatic national security point of concern?
Absolutely.
And this is not to make light, but to be dramatic nonetheless. So Robert, as you're speaking, right? So I'm thinking about our dual banking system, and I'm thinking about the data that we have insight to as blockchain analytics, and the data that sits with the Fed and various regulators and so on. And then I think back to reading the 9/11 commissioner's report, which was, mandatory reading for anybody working in this space. And our biggest blind spot was we had all the data we needed. It was all dispersed everywhere except together. The puzzle was broken. It was all over the place. And this is the dramatic national security point, which is that my concern right now is that in the blind spot that we have and the lack of reconciliation between on-chain and off-chain data, we are missing a lot. And that's where I think we're missing intelligence, we're missing insights. That lack of reconciliation. And I really worry about that because, again, I think we have all the data and intelligence that we need to be super innovative, strong on security, strong national security at the state and federal level, but the data sits everywhere and nowhere at once. And this is the end of my TED Talk on dramatic national security interventions.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a really excellent point. And one of the things that we have heard a lot from industry actors is the need for additional information sharing in the space that's specific to crypto. There is a crypto ISAC that is out there. There's the FS ISAC, which we are members of both and participate in both. But I think that making sure that all of the different players in this very decentralized space and a lot of different people do a lot of different functions throughout the blockchain ecosystem have the opportunity to be able to get the information that they need to be able to protect the space that they're in, that is their domain and their responsibility. There are legal protections that folks need that come from that. Antitrust, of all things, is probably the single biggest one. And it makes sense when you say it out loud. You can't have competitors sharing information between each other, but it's important information. And so Congress has recognized this in a lot of other contexts and made sure that those legal protections are there and robust. And I think that they're particularly important to bring over to crypto.
Hey, Robin, I love what you just said. You kind of stole my thunder around FS ISAC and crypto ISAC. For those who might not be familiar with them, this stands for Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And it's basically, a forum where regulated financial institutions or industry designated participants, right? And there's a bunch of these. There's not just CFS and the crypto, but there's other information sharing and analysis centers. And they typically allow participants to share on almost a Chatham House rules basis what they're seeing around threats and vulnerabilities, so that what one company sees, what it hits one participant or one member, is able to be shared with others, so that we can protect ourselves collectively and as an ecosystem. And I think great point. There's a lot of room for potential, I think, security, collective security gains, through the expansion of efforts like this. And, I go so far, as to say that, in some cases, I think, when companies identify, when companies newly attribute something through their own investigation, through their own intelligence analysis. And financial institutions typically tend to have financial intelligence units, FIUs, right? Which is where the ex DOJ, ex DA, folks at the ex FBI who come into financial services, come into crypto. When those folks are able to attribute, right, something through their hard work and labor, I think there is a sharing process that happens where, their forensic service providers, they're able to share some of their conclusions with them and cascade that, throughout the ecosystem, right? So, a tremendous amount of potential to propagate not only best practices, but intelligence here, to make us all safer.
So I want to remind everyone that there is an opportunity to submit questions through the form, or we will allow at the end some time for some quick Q&A if folks want to take themselves off mute. I just have a couple more things that I wanted to address, and then there are a couple of questions that have already come in, which I'll pose to you all as well. And this is a question for each of you. What do you see as the risks of action, and what do you see as the risk of inaction as it comes to market structure legislation?
I guess I'll start with that one because I've talked about this in the context of stablecoins pretty extensively as well. And let's start with inaction. So I think it's very easy for people to ignore opportunity cost of not doing things, except when you're playing a competitive game against other markets, that comes back to bite you very quickly. And what I mean by that is if future financial services are moving onto blockchain rails, and if international payments, which are tied into those, are moving onto blockchain rails, especially as they start being sort of more and more commingled with what we would think of as traditional securities business, aka are you paying with a dollar or a share of a money market fund for things, then if the United States sits this one out, that means the financial rails of the future will be built somewhere else, controlled by somebody else, and those people will have access to much of the critical data that Liat and Robert have been talking about. Because let me pose two hypothetical situations here. One, we pass good market structure regulation in the United States. A bunch of companies base themselves here, and we have access to all the KYC and AML data from companies that are compliant and generally supportive of the United States. Or two, we don't, and many of those companies are in a place like Hong Kong, where they will be very responsive to people who we may regard as our geopolitical adversaries and not at all responsive to us. In those two cases, we know radically different amounts about what's going on in the global financial system and have radically different amounts of potential control over what's happening in the financial system. So here, the opportunity cost of sitting out is basically this. Regardless of whether you think blockchain will eventually take off or not, because you may be right about that, you may be wrong about that. None of us can predict the future. If it takes off and we did nothing, we have a giant problem, right? And if you think about making strategic decisions in the future and use frameworks like minimization of regret, the thing we are most likely to regret is that we did nothing and it's important and it went somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Austin, I agree with you, right? There's an opportunity cost to, offshoring, right? When, a globally active company might, for instance, want to locate in a place like the EU, which has, relative market certainty, an advanced, although nascent, but pretty well developed, crypto regime, which in conjunction with a stablecoin regime sets clear guidelines for how a supermarket crypto financial service provider, someone who issues stable coins, maybe does derivatives, does crypto investment advice, can sales, trading, and custody, can operate, right? Because those are all permissions that are designated under MiCA, right? So potential conflicts of interest within an organization aside, regulatory framework like MiCA provides a great deal of regulatory clarity, right? And now in conjunction with something the ESMA just put out around stablecoins, provides a roadmap for comprehensive provision of crypto related financial services. So the risk is folks looking at either relocating out of the US, right, or very large global competitors to emerge based on the regulatory certainty that they have in their home markets, and presumably the level of maturity that they have there, and can then, port globally as they seek to expand.
So I feel like both Austin and Robert kind of dropped the mics completely on this one. Everything's been said. The one tiny add-on that I would add, and I completely agree with everything that's been said, is that, market structure is that definitional, almost telling everybody what to do and just get on with it piece that we've been missing in terms of, again, clarity overused right now. But, it's just putting an end to this SEC CFTC conversation, continuing with definitions around different provisions related to consumer protections, strengthening oversight, just basically clarifying those terms and telling everybody to just get on with it. And the cost of not doing that, I don't want to think about it because Austin's described it to a terrifyingly, reality.
Yeah, I am going to take the moderator's prerogative here to add on a few more points to this incredibly excellent set of comments to this threshold question. Love it or hate it, you want to regulate it. Crypto is not going away. And I think the concerns that people have raised about the technology are best addressed through a public policy process where you can come up with solutions to concerns that are raised. That is what we are supposed to do as a country. And the absence of rules in this space has created an opportunity for bad actors. It has also made competitive disadvantages for those that are trying to be good actors. It has left us at a disadvantage in the world in terms of developers that are moving offshore instead of staying here. It has given us, I think, more questions than answers in terms of how consumers are protected, where they are protected, who the regulator is that is protecting them. And while people have been fighting over the answers to that questions, the one thing that they haven't been doing is protecting people. And so the solution to all of this is to regulate the space. It is a highly unusual thing that you have an industry that is standing here saying, please regulate us, begging for things that almost every other industry in Washington shies away from. And these are not light touch regulations that we're talking about implementing either. We're taking tried and true known methods of regulating both on the national security side, but also in terms of the fundamental market structures and applying them to crypto. None of that should be of concern if you are worried about crypto. Love it or hate it, you want to regulate it. And I think it's really just that simple. So there are a couple of questions that we have gotten into the chat, and I will go ahead and ask those now. Again, if folks have questions that you'd like to ask live, you can feel free to do that. Either raise your hand and I'll call on you, or once I'm done with these two questions, you can just take yourself off mute and ask them. So Jackson asked, in relation to national security, we're hearing more and more about who is validating blockchain transactions. And I think it's kind of worth talking about the role that validators play in the crypto ecosystem generally before sort of we get into kind of the specifics of the question. I always liken it to sort of the pipe itself. They're the people in the same way that Comcast or AWS runs a network. They're the people ultimately responsible for making sure that the pipes work in a blockchain ecosystem. But the question is, what are the national security implications of blockchain nodes and validators, and how does that work from a perspective with decentralized networks?
Well, I'll hop in here to say I may be working on writing a few things about this right now, so I'll start with a few thoughts. One is that I think the debate on this has been incredibly underdeveloped, because right now our two endpoints in that are, on one side you have things like the private blockchain efforts of the banks. So take as an example of that JP Morgan's Onyx or Codexis or whatever they're calling it now. And on the other hand, you have things like Bitcoin, which are completely anonymous validator sets that are done in many cases, in the Bitcoin case, by brute computing force, if you really think of how the network is operating. Okay. And in the middle of those are many solutions that as of yet are largely unexplored. So Jackson, one thing I would say is that I think we're pretty early in this discussion, and that regulations and forcing our regulators to come to the table and start making sane rules for how people can operate on these things will let us start having that debate in a significantly more robust way than has happened previous. Because although we have in our mind these canonical, completely anonymous, completely unknown validator sets, I will remind everybody that is not the only way that validators work, even for public open access decentralized blockchains right now. If you look at the architectural design, to throw some examples out of things like Stellar, which has a fully doxed validator set, even though all the wallets are pseudonymous, or you look at something like an Avalanche subnet, where you can permission the validators and pick your friends. There are many ways to sort of slice this. And I would also say security and transaction preferences are not monolithic. How worried I am about somebody paying $5 to buy a latte versus somebody clearing a $2 billion international wire are very different. And I might need very different structures behind that on a network to run it. So to me, this is one where the answer is we have not yet had a real discussion about the trade-offs and security model that we need in each of these cases because, to Robin's point earlier, we've been punting the ball on regulation instead of actually bringing it into the perimeter. So the discussion point from the regulators has been, we don't want to think about it. I think it's something that just dramatically needs to improve going forward, and that there are many feasible solutions and we need to explore them.
I would add one quick point on this, which is to say that, earlier I spoke about the need to flex basic traditional concepts like KYC. This is a perfect example of, KYV, know your validator, right? And those, again, thinking about what are the characteristics of the new technologies that enable us to do things differently and innovating on those concepts to blend and get the best of both worlds in terms of protection. So KYV, know your validator, KYW, know your wallet, just flexing those concepts and understanding what that could mean for us from an operational perspective.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. You guys dropped the mic on me on that.
All right. The next question is from Claire, and it amounts to there's no such thing as perfect legislation in the world. So this is an open opportunity to provide some feedback in terms of, she asks on the Genius Act, but I would throw clarity in there too in terms of ways that Congress might be able to improve it.
I just have
And
2 cents on this one. Thanks, Claire, for the question. Did you want to add anything, Robin? Sorry.
no, go ahead.
Okay, so my 2 cents on this is just pass the legislation already so we can reckon with the aftermath of it, which is working with the agencies to just operationalize, rulemaking, guidance. We're so eager to get into the weeds of how to make this, safety and soundness concept come to life in this blend between TradFi and Web3. And, we just want to get in there. I like that phrasing, Claire, of just, there's no perfect legislation. Let's just get it passed, V1, let's go. And we'll go from there. That would be my
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think, moves to enhance regulatory clarity are always welcome. And I will add, these things always come with implementation timelines, right? So, whether it's 12 months, whether it's 18 months, right? The rule making and the rule writing, process is going to require some consultation. And, those things take time, right? And tweaks can be made, and there isn't a law in the books that hasn't been amended or revised or changed, right? One of the wonderful things about our approach to to legislative governance is you've always got the opportunity to write and rewrite new legislation, right? And things can always get challenged in the courts. And there's multiple ways to fix things if they're not perfect. And I would argue, even given the rapid pace of global regulatory change and technology change, something that might be pretty darn near perfect today sure isn't going to be perfect 3-4 years from now, maybe not even 2 years from now. So progress is good, right? But not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good is also great. And I think to the extent that legislators understand the need for legislation that is maybe more principles based and can flex over time, we're gonna be better off.
You also can't play a sport at a professional level without practicing or training for it in most cases. And one of the things we most need legislation for is to start building the reps and building these muscles in our regulators. Right now, if I go to any of the OCC, the FDIC, the CFTC, the SEC, the Federal Reserve, They do not have large bodies of knowledge in this space or people who have been in this space consistently and understand what's going on because they haven't had to. It hasn't been particularly relevant to them. So in many ways, there's going to be a feedback loop of we'll start legislating, our regulatory muscles will improve, we'll get better findings and understanding in our public servants, which will lead to better legislation. And then that loop continues in a virtuous cycle. See the US financial system, which is the crown jewel of the world. We didn't get here in one shot. It's not like we passed like the 33 Act and we're like, we're done, right? There's been many iterations from there.
Yeah, I think both of those are incredibly important points, Roberts, that we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And Austin, your point about you have to practice to play in the NFL. I think we're sitting in a moment where we've had the House passing Fit 21 last year with 279 votes, one of the single most bipartisan votes in the entire last session of Congress. We've had the Senate considering CFTC spot market legislation since 2022. We've had the House considering CFTC spot market legislation since 2020. We have the 33 Act, we have the 34 Act, we have the 40 Act. We know how to do this. And the delta between the issues that still need to be resolved and the issues that we really know how to do is really quite small. So the moment is now, and I think the opportunity is in front of us, and it's time to act. So with that and my impassioned Go Team speech there at the end, unless there are any other immediate questions, that will conclude today's event. Really appreciate you all getting on and for taking this opportunity. And please call your member of Congress to tell them to get onto it. It's time to act.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you again to our partner, Coinbase Institute, and our fabulous panelists today. I hope you all learned as much as I did about what is a really critical issue. And if you want to watch the recording, I know some folks asked, there will be a recording of this event that we'll post on our website by next week. Thanks so much again. Bye.